Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to New Books in Diplomatic History, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. I'm Andrew Pace, the host of the channel. Our guest today is Donald Stoker, a professor of national security and resource strategy in the Dwight D. Eisenhower School at the National Defense University. Today, we'll be talking about his new book, and really, I think his magnum opus, Purpose and Power, U.S. Grand Strategy from the Revolutionary Era to the Present, which was published this year in 2024 by Cambridge University Press. Hi, Don. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Andrew. Thanks for having me. Been looking forward to it. It'll be fun.
Would you start us off, Don, by just telling us a little bit about yourself and how your work in military theory and grand strategy led to this book?
Well, I'm originally from Cairo, Georgia, which is a tiny, tiny town not far from Tallahassee, Florida, that's spelled just like Cairo, but properly pronounced. And my Egyptian neighbors in California, when I lived there, were very amused by where I was from because he was from the real Cairo. So he used to laugh at me about it, pick on me about it. It was pretty fun. But I did my PhD at Florida State University. I finished in 97, but I went to work for the Naval War College in 1999 teaching strategy. And that I'd always had an interest in. I did my degree in military and diplomatic history, and particularly European history. And so, but working for the Naval War College, you're exposed to the methodology they use and the emphasis on theory. And that really sparked, I'd always had an interest in theory. I'd always read it, but they supplied you with frameworks on how to think about it, which was useful. And the methodology that they use, which I've kind of adapted, which they stole from Oxford, and they will proudly tell you that. And that, teaching strategy for so long for the Naval War College, that inspired me to write this book and to write the stuff that I've written on theory, because one of the struggles always when you're working for the various military organizations, and you're especially if you're trying to develop curriculum, is what do you use for readings? And that's always a difficult thing. And so the book, in many respects, is written for people that do what I do, that try to teach strategy and try to teach diplomacy and so on. And to me, knowing what we did in the past and how the country used power and for what aims is really, really critical to understand that, because there are a lot of myths about use of American power.
Yeah. And you start your book off with this framework for strategic analysis, which I think is important to understand some of the theory that's really underpinning your analysis and argument here. But what is grand strategy? It's kind of a hot topic. I mean, it's always a hot topic in diplomatic history circles, but there seems to be a lot of talk about grand strategy. What is it, and how is it different from foreign policy?
Yeah, see, this is the first obstacle to overcome, because when you throw out the word grand strategy, it's the old joke about economists. You ask 3 economists a question, you get 4 answers. The same thing applies to ask historians, political scientists, IR people what grand strategy is, and you get 42 different answers, all of which will conflict, because there's in the literature is frankly a wreck, and there's just no agreement on what it even means. Is it the aim? Is it how you're using power? Is it some combination of these things? Is it something that has to be long-term? Can small states have it or not? And so, but I can show you sources that have all of these things and sometimes multiple meanings for it in the same source. And so the first thing I had to sort out in my mind was, okay, what does this even mean? How do you make it useful? And here's where the methodology that the Naval War College uses came in handy and kind of underpins it, because strategy is how you use your power, to get what you want. And you could lop off the word grand strategy and just use the word strategy, and that would be acceptable. But part of the reason, some of the difficulty with people sorting it out is the word grand, and so they immediately think it has to be big and overarching. Well, maybe it isn't, so we kind of impose a restriction, impose a constraint on our own thinking there with that. But so I built this framework where, so countries act because they're driven by their interests, and can be very subjective, and it varies, can vary by the leader. Example I use, And when we look at the Korean War, the American intervention in the Korean War, if you would ask American military leaders, oh, is it in our interest to fight a war here in Korea? If you asked them that in early 1950, they would have told you no, and it was insane. But in July of 1950, we're fighting a war in Korea because the administration has decided it's within the Americans' interests now at this point to do so. And so interests usually drive what a country does. And so, but then ideally, they then develop political aims or have political aims that they wish to accomplish when they get involved in things, whether in peace or in war. And so then they harness their national power, again, ideally, they harness their national power, elements of national power, in order to achieve these political aims that they've decided they either have to achieve or that they wish to achieve. And so here's where you get the idea of grand strategy, because you have your various elements of power, elements of strategy, and you have the diplomatic strategy, information strategy, which can include things like ideology, intelligence, propaganda, diplomacy. And then you have a military strategy, how you use your military power, both in peace and in war. And then your economic strategy, how you use your economic power. And ideally, this machine is being harnessed to accomplish certain political ends or political aims, and ideally these political aims are all in the interest of the country to achieve. Doesn't always work that way, obviously, because sometimes countries don't act wisely. Sometimes their aims aren't necessarily good ones. Sometimes they seek aims that they can't achieve. Sometimes they're very inefficient at harnessing their power. And so that's the thing I had to do at first was, in my mind, lay out this framework to do it. I mean, it's not a revolutionary framework. It takes ideas from different places, but tries to make it into a framework where, okay, here's what we're doing. And then feeding into this framework, you're always at the risk you undertake, the assessments that you have to make, and the constant reassessment with it as well, because it's constantly information comes in, there are actions that are taken, third-party actors involved that you might not have considered. So it's a very iterative process, which can be function well or not function, and there are a lot of things you can't predict. But that was, to me, that was the thing you had to do first. Like, how are you even going to tackle this? And so I built this framework, taking these ideas from different places. And then I use it as a template to apply it to American history, both for each administration, and some of them I have to blend together because it's a lot to cover, and particularly though for each war that the United States is, or the bulk of them. Some I've had to grind into a paragraph. So,
Sure.
Because the book is 800 pages, it covers a lot.
Well, and you do a nice job of explaining the relationship or interrelationship between political aims, policies, interests, and strategy, and pointing out that the United States has often had, as you say, grand strategies, right? There's an economic component, there's a military, there's an information component, a diplomatic component. But you start your book in 1776 in the Revolutionary era, and you say that for most of its history, the United States has pursued security, sovereignty, and expansion. What did those three purposes mean for the United States, and how did the U.S. pursue those aims?
Yeah, I mean, those go up. There are other aims, obviously, as well, but I found those were consistent up until the turn of the 19th and 20th century, until the first Roosevelt administration. And obviously, when you start looking at the American Revolution and you think about security, well, you think about sovereignty, you think about security, you think about expansion. The sovereignty issue was, of course, a driving thing here. The United States wants its independence. It wants to be completely rule itself and to govern itself and not have anybody else interfere with it. And that's spelled out really clearly in the Declaration of Independence as this is what we want. But also, then they want to secure that. They want to hold that as well afterward, and that's a driving point and ends up influencing how we deal with the countries, the colonial possessions of those or other places around us. And the expansion part is there even from even before the Declaration of Independence, even before they actually have made a country and actually have decided upon independence. The Continental Congress is already talking about how to have Canada, and they would like to take land from the Indians in the West. And so these three things end up being huge drivers throughout the end of the 18th and throughout the 19th century, and they're drivers both in peace and in war. Because you look at the numerous wars we fight with the Indians and various Indian nations, and a lot of these are fought purely to take their land. Sometimes they're not fought for that reason, but very often it's actually spelled out very clearly when these wars have aim. Sometimes they don't, because sometimes they're started spontaneously and they figure out what they want later. The settlers would go into Indian lands and stir up the Indians, and then there would be fighting and a massacre, and then the army would have to come in, and they're like, well, what a mess. They never want to do it, but yeah, it always ends up being their job to clean up the mess. But you can see how in War of 1812, the sovereignty issue, very clear there. This is the British don't respect American sovereignty, dealing with the British threat as a security issue as well. Expansion into Canada, there's an argument about whether that's an aim or not, but certainly the administration certainly wanted it. When you look at like the Jefferson administration and you look at Monroe, Adams, and others, even in peacetime, they're seeking expansion, whether you're taking or you're buying Louisiana Purchase, or you're John Quincy Adams, and where he's Secretary of State, and he's, well, the Spanish are a problem. We need to acquire parts of Florida because they're a problem. If we have to engineer a war on well, we can figure that out. But we've got this problem with the British, so you see all through that century where sometimes it's done by force, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's done by purchase, sometimes it's by negotiation. And the most ruthless example of it has to be the Mexican War, because it's so clearly Polk must be the most Machiavellian president we have yet had. So because he's so determined I'm going to get Mexico. If I can't bribe my way through it or buy it, or get it through diplomacy, then I will simply go to war and take it from you. You guys choose which one of these you want. I'm fine with either. So because he's very clear, I'm going to go to Mexico. Here are the things I'm going to take. Here's what I'm willing to settle for. So and it's very just brute force, Machiavellian brute force of power. Yeah. No excuses, no doubts in his mind whether or not it's right. So it's fascinating because I had not looked at some of these wars closely. I'd read about them, but I had never looked deeply at some of them and say, what exactly are they thinking? At the very top here when they're launching these things. So it ends up being very fascinating sometimes.
Right. And then all of a sudden there's this shift.
Yeah.
John Quincy Adams famously announces in 1821 that the United States goes not forth in search of monsters to destroy.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what the United States did through much of the 20th century
up until today. Yeah.
So
in some respects. Yeah.
So why did the United States become this dragon slayer, so to speak, and pursue security, sovereignty, and democracy during the 20th century?
Yeah, the expansionism idea goes away, with the conquest of the West, and we take a few things in the Caribbean, and then Roosevelt takes Panama essentially to build the canal. Then we buy some islands, like in 1916, buy some islands in the Caribbean. But that's it for the expansionism ends at that point, which is an interesting thing because a lot of times America is accused of being an empire builder and an expansionist in the time after that. But we don't acquire anything after that, and we don't go to war to do so after that. I mean, we're just not interested. None of the administrations are interested in doing that. And that's something that the Europeans don't stop doing until Second World War. So which is an interesting distinction to make. But you have, with the arrival of the Wilson administration, this idea that American power can be used to make the world safe for democracy, which is a pretty ambitious thing, to say the least here.
Yes.
And where now what's interesting is his idea is not completely new, obviously. I mean, there are other people writing about it before, and you see some inklings of this, in a different form, obviously, back to Jefferson, Jefferson one time, Jefferson always was postulating ideas, and one of them was one of his thoughts about having a continent that had other American-like democracies on it, as that America didn't necessarily control, but they would be democratic. And so you see this idea of spreading democracy and the debate about it. It kind of perks up from time to time. But Wilson, he essentially weaponizes the progressive impulse to make the world safe for democracy, and then this becomes something that it doesn't necessarily always drive, because again, there are other aims, there are other things, but it's one of the big impulses and one of the big purposes for what power will be used. And when we go to war with other nations, we generally will try to leave a democratic power there afterward. Not always the case, obviously, and there are always exceptions to this, but it ends up being, but it's a very different thing when you think about it. You go from expansion to trying to leave a democratic colleague, ally, and competitor, behind. Is what happens as well. When you think we created democracies in Japan and Korea and created two very powerful economic competitors in the course of doing it. So
absolutely.
So it's an interesting shift to watch, because I didn't have this idea about these things going into the book. I mean, it kind of evolved as I started doing the research and looking at it and saying, well, what do they really want? What are they really looking to achieve here? And it kind of, I mean, sure, other people have written about similar things, obviously, but the formation of it was a little slow to come to me.
There's also I guess a less obvious shift in your book, in two really detailed chapters that you have on World War II and the Korean War, and you talk about the purposes of American power, and then you say that that the United States mislabeled the situation after 1945 by calling this rivalry with the Soviet Union a Cold War, and you instead refer to it as a hot peace. Why do you say that the Cold War is mislabeled, and how did that matter for American administrations?
Yeah, I'm not the first person to make the argument, obviously, with that. I mean, and it makes sense as to when you look at why they called it a Cold War. If you're sitting in the position of the American leaders at the time, it makes perfect sense as to why they do it, because they've just come out of the experience of the Second World War, this great conflagration that kills perhaps 60 million people, wrecks half the world. And then they are suddenly thrust in this position to where the United States has a role that it's never had before. And it's directly threatened by a very aggressive and expansive Soviet Union. And they just don't know what to do. And the situation then becomes so intense, and especially by the time of the Korean War, but even before this, the situation, is so intense that it feels like a war to them. It's not a war, but it feels like a war to them. So it's very understandable why they brand it that. But one of the referees, had 3 referees for the book, which is pretty normal. One of the referees was appalled that I dared say it wasn't a war. But it wasn't a war. This was we call it strategic competition now. We weren't at war with the Soviet Union and some of these other communist countries. I mean, we practiced subversion and espionage and 100 other things. But but the problem, I think, is, and when you call something a war and it's not a war, it colors how you define it. And the reality is that war and peace are two different things, despite what a lot of people are writing in some of the military literature nowadays, and some of the doctrinal publications even, they confuse this very much. But once had an argument in a meeting, and the people were appalled that I dared say that there was a difference between peace and war, and it was kind of important to understand it. The only person who wasn't mad at me was the Marine officer who had 3 combat deployments in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan. He was pretty sure there was a difference. He kind of thought I was right, So, like, you guys take that for what you want with it. So, I mean, I think it's important to. I mean, sometimes I probably go a little overboard on trying to force people to define the terms, and that can be a little constraining sometimes. But I think it's really important to understand the basis of the argument that you're having and the debate that you're having, because if you don't understand the terms of the argument, how are you going to do your analysis? Where's the foundation for your analysis? And this is part of the problem with a lot of the grand strategy literature and the strategic studies literature in general, where they don't really ever look at, or they don't seriously look at what the country that's involved in the struggle is trying to achieve, and they focus upon the means being used, which is fine. I mean, in the sense that it's important to understand this, and it's important to understand how they're using the means. But the basis of the analysis is what they want, because what do they want? How badly do they want it? How much are they willing to fight for it? Clausewitz talks about the value of the object. People will fight for the object as long as they're willing to pay the price for it. And when the day they aren't willing to pay the price, then you can start talking to them. So, and his idea is still valid. I mean, it hasn't changed with it. So, but if you're just looking at the means, if your focus is on the means a country is willing to commit, that's valuable, obviously, for a whole host of reasons. But there are other pieces of the puzzle.
Mm-hmm. You then talk about the end of the Cold War and the post-Cold War world. And a lot of histories view U.S. foreign policy during the 1990s as sort of aimless or purposeless after the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and then argue that the U.S. rediscovered or adopted a new national purpose after 9/11 with the global war on terror. But you link Bush 2 with Bush 1 and Clinton in your book. Well, why do you see them as a kind of package in the post-Cold War era?
Well, I mean, some of the things are the same with them. They deal with some of the same problems, and they're, well, for the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, they really want to, I mean, they're really interested in consolidating the gains from the Cold War. I mean, the Cold War's over, okay. Now, no one has thought about what to do after it's over, which is interesting. You've spent 45 years dealing with this, and then, oh, what do we do when it ends? Oh, we don't have the slightest idea. No one's ever thought, which is fascinating to me to think about. People are so consumed with the problem, they don't think about what to do afterward. But the administration, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and nobody's thinking too about what's the role of NATO in the absence of a Warsaw Pact.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
where does NATO go from here?
Yeah, and it becomes a tool for consolidating the gains and for of the Cold War, and for building security in Europe and uniting Europe, and part of the process. This is something that the Bush administration really pushes. They push, a stronger EU. They want a Germany within NATO, because because this rips the guts out of the Soviet security system. They're very plain about that, not public statements, but they would also like to bring the entire East Bloc and the Soviet Union into former Soviet Union, into a democratic world. So they're not interested in, one of the things you see, particularly in the IR literature, I think, maybe, is you see, this idea of American hegemony afterward. It's complete nonsense. There's no document. I found nothing that ever said any administration wanted hegemony and ever saw it. I mean, and that's some of the accusations made against the Bush administration. What they want is, they want security. They'd like a peaceful world, and they'd like to disarm. And they do these things. If you're one hegemony, why are you disarming? And so some of the problems that the Bush administration has, because there's a lot of instability afterward, and so trying to deal with these problems, it's difficult for them, and because the Clinton administration in some respects suffers the same difficulties, because they both would like the Europeans to take more of a role in the Balkans and places like that, but it just doesn't happen. The only way the Europeans end up acting in these places is when the United States start to get involved, and it's a lot of chaos and a lot of disaster and a lot of bloodshed, as you know. But they have some of the same problems, and the same problem. Then Iraq, of course, is one of the problems for all three of these administrations as well. What do you do about Iraq? And the first Bush administration was interested and not interested in the same time with overthrowing Saddam Hussein. And there's actually, since I've written the book, I was talking to someone who's doing some research on it, and he's writing something that he's going to argue that they're more interested in overthrowing it than what we think now. So it'll be interesting, excuse me, to see where his research goes with that. But the Clinton administration officially adopts, the overthrowing of Saddam as a political aim. They're never serious about it, do it for political reason, they're pushed toward it. But then you get the other Bush administration that then does actually overthrow, which of course goes not as well as they expected, to say the least. So you do have the linkage in that era, but 9/11 changes things as well, because you have this hope for this post-war peace and stability, the new global order, which ends up being very unstable, and a lot more unstable than people hoped for it to be. So, and then 9/11 is kind of a kicker for a whole host of reasons, obviously.
Sure.
Kind of changes things.
And a lot of these linkages, as you described them, continue into the Obama and Trump and Biden administrations, Afghanistan, ISIS.
Iraq.
Iraq
2 and 3.
Yeah, that's right. But again, you title your final part of the book "Retreat and Defeat."
Yeah.
What do you see as the major connections and the continuities and discontinuities, I guess, between Obama, Trump, and Biden and the Bush and Clinton administrations that came before?
Well, you see, the continuity is the involvement with Iraq, obviously, in so many different ways, because, the list goes on of problems there. But we never really ended either war very well, which is a problem, because if you don't end the war properly, maybe you get to do it again. And it's easy to say that, to end it properly, but extremely difficult in all the situations there. But you also see, I'm sorry, can you hear me still?
Yeah, I can hear you.
By mistake. Yeah. I called it retreat because a continuity that you see with and as a historian, I'm appalled that I'm writing about something so close to the subject. So we're supposed to wait 50 years. But you see with the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the Biden administration, all of them will be appalled to think there's any continuity. From both sides of the aisle. But you see, you're seeing this pulling back from American commitments. Part of it is because of the exhaustion from Iraq, and just the unwillingness to get involved. But at the same time, you see some of the same mistakes. Like the Obama administration is very critical of the Bush administration's mistakes in Iraq, and they're not completely wrong about this. But then you see them launch this war in Libya, where they make all the same mistakes, possibly even worse, and leave the country a complete wreck. But you see that, and you see with the Obama's famous browbeating of Cameron into getting British government to pay 2%, where Trump does the same thing. I mean, he just goes even farther with it. So you see that continuity. At the same time, both of them, particularly Obama, by the end of his administration, he's trying to get out of places. He's trying to withdraw from places. Trump as well, and Biden obviously as well, particularly with Afghanistan. He just throws it away. So you see a continuity where you have this criticism of allies, sometimes abandonment of allies, and you see in America this trying to get rid of its commitments and trying to reduce its commitments. And you can argue, obviously, the aims and the motivations and the procedures and how they do it for all three of these administrations. You can make a lot of arguments about the differences and what's going on. Yeah, that will go on endlessly. But there are the similarities with that are there as well. Which is a change from where we saw during the Cold War, and even in the post-Cold War world, we saw a growing American commitment to other nations, particularly democratic partners. This became a key plank of what just about every administration from Truman onward was dealing with democratic partners, and with the Reagan administration pushing our partners who were not democratic to becoming democratic partners, of which they were very successful. So I see. I'm oversimplifying it, obviously, but I do see some continuities there that maybe aren't so apparent when you first look.
Sure.
You strip away some of the things they say about each other and see what they actually do.
This book is really nicely telescoped, and it has to be, to cover from the Revolutionary era to the present. But zooming out, to flesh out some of these sort of major themes that you highlight. What are the lessons that we should learn from the history of U.S. grand strategy? And one of the things that comes through in your book is the importance of having clear political aims.
Yeah.
and strategies that are coherent with those aims. And yet, so often you point out that US officials confused ends, ways, and means.
Yeah.
Why did that happen so often?
I think one of the reasons is, particularly in the last couple of decades, where we have no clarity on how we teach these things and how we explain them and how we understand them. Nobody has the same definitions for them. No one understands what's important. I think that's part of them. Well, example of how, I've worked in strategic studies now for decades. And, when I'm teaching, one of the things I do on the first day of class is I ask people, okay, define the word policy for me. This is a little pedantic, I know, but you'd be shocked at the number of different answers that you get. Oh, is policy what you do or what you want? Oh, is it the rules? Is it the limits under what you can do? Is it the instructions that your agency has given you? So I do that in a class of students that are senior civilians or senior military officers, or if I'm somewhere else teaching, lecturing or something. And it's like having a whole room full of economists. You get a whole bunch of different answers. See, and that's part of the problem. And then people just say policy, and now I have no idea what they mean when they say policy, and often they don't either. So that's part of the problem. I mean, how do you develop a standard lexicon for talking about this stuff? It's hard to do. I mean, it's because it's the different fields look at things at different ways. People don't emphasize things different way, or people don't think that certain things are as important as other people do. I mean, my emphasis from the political aim is fed by all these years working for the Naval War College that I, for 18 years, and then by my study of Clausewitz and other theorists as well. I mean, that is just such, and what's nice about that is understanding the aim, it gives you an objective basis for analysis, because then you can say, is this good? How are they going to get it? Is what they're doing, does it make sense? And, since another problem, we don't think often seriously about the resourcing issues with it. And I have to say that because I work at the Eisenhower School, and that's one of our primary efforts. But the means is certainly critical. Can you generate the means to get what you want? Are you willing to use the means? And the fact is, when you get into a war or something, you're very, very difficult to ever understand what the means you're going to need. What means are you going to need? It's very hard to figure out, because the war will not go like you thought it did or thought it would. We see the artillery starvation in the Ukraine now. It's the same problem they had in the First World War, where they ran out of shells and stuff like that, and people are scrambling all over the world to find ammunition now. So some of these problems repeat themselves, but educating. Lucas Milewski actually wrote an article about this a couple of years ago on a similar thing about it, and he said that he thinks part of the problem with why the thinking and sometimes the execution is done so badly is because so often the people in charge, they don't really know anything about history. They don't really know how foreign relations was done in the past and what Secretary of State did what and why. They don't understand the history of the past wars, and that just the basic knowledge that so many people have in positions of leadership just isn't there anymore. So I don't know if he's right about it, but I don't disagree with him. I mean, his argument I thought was pretty solid, but it's obviously not an argument that would fit with everyone or everything, but it's something to consider.
Sure. Well, and let's talk more about theory a little bit, because you obviously have taken a strong theoretical approach to the study of U.S. grand strategy, and you talk in your conclusion about how Americans from the president on down to staff and policymakers need to have a better understanding of history and theory. And yet you also point out that U.S. officials so often relied on flawed assumptions or theories like limited war, domino theory. You critique Schelling's arms and influence and Rostow's modernization theory.
One of the worst books on strategy ever written. I make entire groups of people angry when I say that. His historical bases are flawed. So he's making arguments on flawed history. I'm sorry, I said it out loud, didn't I? I'm not allowed to talk badly about Schelling. Oh, my colleagues get so mad when I say that. I said, but he's wrong. Here's why he's wrong. So it's become a joke with certain of my friends.
So what are we to do, though, if on the one hand theory is so important?
Yeah, and yet we have good theory from bad theory,
right? And why have American officials so often relied on flawed understandings of theory.
Yeah.
And how do we teach good theory? Do we need a revival of Clausewitz and the
Yes.
foreign policy blob? Do we need more seminars focused on war? What's it going to take?
The problem with teaching more Clausewitz is people teach it wrong generally. So, which is I spent 4 years writing a biography of Clausewitz. It will reprogram your brain if you actually seriously study him, and you will become more logical. That's the only reason I have even a logical strand at all in my whole body is from that. But yeah, I mean, I should have looked at one of the lesson plans we have, is we have a lesson on, okay, how do you tell good theory from bad theory? And, is it factually based? Is it based upon history? Is it logical? Does it work actually in the real world when it's applied? These are things that, particularly the last one, when you look and see, okay, the Kennedy administration labored under this idea of modernization theory, which in boiled down to a simplistic nutshell is everything the United States does is the best, and this will work anywhere else in the world because it's the best. Okay, so it worked out really well for them in Vietnam and other places. It's this assumption that our methods are instantly transferable to another place when maybe perhaps it assumes a lot. So when does it work in the real world? Well, when you think about Schelling's whole signaling theory, which underpins the use of air power in Vietnam, did it work in the real world? No, it failed miserably and killed thousands of people. Why is this still an underpinning of how we teach strategy in a lot of our schools? I teach it every term, but then I teach it and say, well, here's why it was wrong, and here's all the people that killed and the 900 planes that got shot down because they had bad ideas and they didn't match it to reality. So and then I'll get nasty. You'll get nasty comments from me making fun of Schelling. But my colleagues pick on me at work about it too, so it's pretty fun. So.
You've also written extensively about the importance of ending wars and America's struggles to do so, not just in this book, but in prior works. And you recently published an article on ending the war in Ukraine.
The challenges of ending the war in the Ukraine.
Certainly.
A colleague of mine. Yeah.
And understandably, a lot of the literature on military theory and strategic studies focuses on winning the war, but not on winning the peace. So why is it so difficult to terminate wars successfully? And what does a successful end to a war look like?
Yeah, that successful end is, well, what do you want? What are you there at the war to get? There are a lot of people say, well, a better peace is defined that. I was lucky that when working for the Naval War College, one of the colleagues that I only worked with him a little while because he was in Newport and I was in California, but he developed this methodology for examining how to think about ending a war. He's a guy named Bradley. He's a super smart guy and great lecturer. And he says, and I stole it whole cloth from him, and I put the footnote in there to say that. So because it's the best thing I've ever seen develop for it. It says, what do you want politically? How far do you go militarily, or how do you use your military power? And who's going to enforce the peace and how? And so in my book on Why America Loses Wars, my book on limited war theory, the last chapter of the book addresses that subject. And I take those 3 points and just try to go through the complexity and the difficulty and the sheer awfulness of all of these problems and how it's very, very difficult. And then I read basically all the literature I could find that talked about the difficulties and the problems of ending wars. And it's something that is one of the weakest areas in strategic studies weakest is not the right word, but it's one of the least studied areas because we, like you mentioned, and we talk about, why countries go to war and how they fight wars and how they resource the wars. But then what are the complications with ending it? Because every war's different. The ending is going to be different. If you're completely conquering the place and imposing your will on it, well, that's one way to end it. But what if you've got the Korean War, you have to negotiate a settlement because you aren't interested or you don't desire to use sufficient power to do what you really want to do. You want to get out. It's also, you want to make a deal, but the other side doesn't want to make a deal. Well, they sort of do, but not really. So how do you convince? I mean, so it's an extremely complex subject, but it's one that, we teach a lesson on it, and because it's so important. I mean, it's so important, and it's something that people aren't taught. I know I was never taught that in all of my many years of graduate school. So it is critical, and hopefully more people will write on it, because we need some people that really look at it to write some good stuff on it.
Yeah. Well, I have one final question to ask about your work here. After reviewing in 700 to 800 pages the long history of American grand strategy, I think one of the questions that your synthesis sort of begs is, well, what should American grand strategy be? But in your conclusion, you say that's the wrong question to ask.
It's the wrong question.
So why is it the wrong question, and what question should we be asking?
The question is, what do you want? What do you want to achieve? What are the aims that the administrations are going to seek? It's not one of the problems that people want to have this blanket grand strategy to deal with every problem, but the problem is every problem is different. If you've got different aims, if you have different aims, and a country like the United States will have different aims. We'll have aims toward Europe, what we want. We'll have aims toward China. We'll have aims toward Russia. We'll have aims toward Latin America. Using your power in the same way for all of these is not going to give you your aims, because these are completely different situations. And sometimes you'll be at war. Sometimes you'll be at peace. Sometimes you'll be at war someplace and at peace in others. And so you've got to figure out what you want and then adjust the strategy toward it. Sometimes containment is taken as, oh, well, this is grand strategy and everything was containment. Well, even containment was addressed initially just at the Soviet Union. It was a strategy used to, in Kennan's words, well, if we do this, Soviet Union will either mellow or come apart. It would just take a while. But that wasn't something that was supposed to be applied, in his view, to the whole world. Versions of it become applied to other places, but having this one size fits all is very, very difficult, because every situation has its own nuances and own problems and own challenges.
Yeah. So the one lesson that I think I took from this book is that purpose comes before power, right? And that's the order of your book there.
Yeah.
So, which I think is a great note to end on. We've taken up too much of your time, but thanks so much for being on the show and for doing the interview. If you don't mind my asking, what are you working on now or next?
No big project, because the last one almost killed me. But I've been working on a number of articles on different subjects that'll pop up. I did a little thing recently about the myth of American hegemony, and I did the article you mentioned about the problems of trying to end the Ukraine war, and that's basically all I've been doing lately, is just a few articles here and there. So I'm afraid to take on a big project again. Maybe I'll get my courage up in another year or so.
Yeah, you need some time away from from all the publishing and all the writing, 800 pages. So
yeah.
Well, thanks again for being on the show. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It was great fun.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.